Welcome to Civics and Coffee. My name is Alicia, and I am a self professed history nerd. Each week, I'm going to chat about a topic on U.S. history and give you both the highlights and occasionally break down some of the complexities in history and share stories you may not remember learning in high school, all in the time it takes to enjoy a cup of coffee. Hey everyone, welcome back. One of the things I absolutely love about this podcast is that it gives me the opportunity to chat with some of my favorite scholars, including this week's guest, Dr. Hilary Green. Dr. Green holds a PhD in history from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, and her research and teaching interests include the American Civil War, Reconstruction, and Civil War memory. I have long admired Dr. Green's scholarly work, including her book, Educational Reconstruction, and I had been eagerly awaiting her latest effort, Unforgettable Sacrifice. Luckily for me, and for you, dear listener, Dr. Green agreed to sit down and chat about her book with me. I hope you all enjoy the conversation. All right. Welcome back, everyone. With me today is esteemed historian, Dr. Hilary Green. She is the James B. Duke Professor of Africana Studies at Davidson College and an author who is here to chat about her latest book, Unforgettable Sacrifice. It is an understatement to say that I am so excited to have Dr. Green with me today. So, without further ado, welcome, Dr. Green.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for coming on. And so let's dive into this amazing book. You start your book by outlining your decision to engage with a new archive source, African American porches. Why are African American porches so important to telling this story?
It's my entry to the Civil War, honestly. I heard from my family, community, and other individuals tell me their stories from their porches. And it's in there and hearing this from childhood and into adulthood, and then reading the historiography and reading how other scholars have done this. I'm like, you haven't talked about these communities. You haven't talked about these families who preserved a different understanding of the Civil War that was hyper local, hyper communal, but also to push against their erasure. And so for me, one of the things about the porch is even as a child and as an adult, as children, we were to be seen and not heard. So when we were being told, we were expected to listen and to expected to hear. And when we had questions, we could ask them. But for me, my question was like, in the end, I heard these stories so personal. People brought out their scrapbooks, their materials, but I never saw it in the official books. So I writing this book, I had to combine the traditional archives that I'm used to using, census records and everything else, with these stories and material culture that these communities carefully preserved for the future. And by combining that, the porch becomes a space where it's an archive alongside our traditional ones. One's no different than the other, but when you combine them together, you get a more richer story.
Yeah, and this is a kind of a avant-garde type of an archive. So how do you collect and categorize porch archives?
There's a couple of things. One of the best is finding those older community members in the community because they're the ones who most likely are the historians for the community. And so for me, oral histories are so important to capture one way because each family had a contribution to this larger communal archive. And then also, too, when you combine them together, you can get the bigger trends and themes. The other, quite frankly, is I would say go to museums and traditional archives because now they're collecting them. They're collecting the photography, they're collecting the scrapbooks, and they're digitized. And so some of these porches and these archives that are in people's basements and attics are actually making it to traditional repositories. And then the other way is this means you're going to have to travel to all sorts of places and go to someone's porch and drink some lemonade and iced tea to be here. So you're going to have to do a lot more work where you're not in a nice air conditioning space anymore, but you actually have to go to the community and you'll be surprised on what they come out with. And oftentimes those historical societies, geological rooms and the like are the other way. They're the first step of those communal archives and the portraits getting preserved. Now they're coming into the traditional ones that we think of at universities as well as other repositories. And it's much harder because you have to do all three. You just
Yeah.
can't do one and get them all.
And it was beautifully weaved together. And let's dive into kind of some of the meat of your book, which you talk about the events of Gettysburg. So, how does African American memory alter our understanding of the events at Gettysburg?
Yes, especially for the South Central Pennsylvania communities that I write about. They're on the border. So when they talk about this Gettysburg, they talk about invasions and occupation because Confederate troops for the Gettysburg campaign come in mid-June and they get all the way up close to Harrisburg. And along the way, they are setting up in communities like Waynesboro, Chambersburg, Mercersburg, and they're occupying that part of the state. And because they're occupying that behind the state, then they start seizing freeborn African Americans who had not already left out of the signs of war. So for them, they talk about individuals who fought in Gettysburg, but those who were stolen. And that word stolen is so strong, but they really talk about that. And they talk about Lee and his troops as people stealers.
Mhm.
And the worst that you could be is steal a horse and then to steal a person. So it's for them, they're using the strongest terms possible. And so the seizure is happening, and then white civilians are trying to stop these soldiers too by saying, like, no, these are freeborn African Americans. These are our community members, and they're being pushed aside. African Americans are being taken, children, women, men, and couples, and taken out of the communities who were in lifelong born there. And then those who came back out. My favorite song is by Joseph Winters. I talk about in the book. His title, 10 Days After Gettysburg, is when he and others stop hearing the sounds of war that they know they can come back out. And that's when they see a changed landscape of people who were taken. So for Gettysburg, for that community, those who were taken and put into slavery. Some men who are able to escape and come back and tell about their stories. One man like Amos Barnes, who white members of the community actually secure his release from Richmond. He comes back in early December, and that causes a wave of men to then enlist because they're like, oh, we're fighting for someone who actually came back. We know that what happened. We need to liberate them as well. So for Gettysburg, it's about not what happened July 1st
Yeah.
onward. It's what happened before. And by having African Americans look at those who enlisted before Gettysburg in those early ways and those who enlisted after Gettysburg, those community members who were taken and never came back, those community members who were taken and then after the war able to get their children back, they talk about that civilian trauma a
Right.
lot more. And we think, so for Gettysburg, it's not more on the battlefield, it's about the civilians
Yeah.
who are experiencing this trauma and African Americans borne the brunt of it.
That story was, for me, it just kind of gave me this new rich context under which to understand the battle and to understand its impacts to the surrounding community. So I thought it was very, very well articulated. And what was the grand review of armies, and how did the Garnet League respond?
Yeah, so this is one of these events that captures the end of the Civil War. So May 23rd and 24th, 1865, this is a military procession of armies from members of the armies of the Tennessee, Army of Georgia, and the Army of Potomac, who are paraded and celebrating the end of the war. And this is important because the city's still mourning Lincoln's death. So to have this grand celebration over 2 days of these returning white soldiers matters. But what happens in it is it's all white soldiers. African American soldiers, including some of the people from my ancestors' regiment, the 22nd USCT, who were involved in Lincoln's procession after his death, aren't included. So this is an all-white affair with a couple of African Americans serving as comic relief. The Garnet League, which is an all African American group out of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, take this as the greatest insult possible because African Americans from across the state, in particular, listed in the 22nd to 24th, and all these regiments that get trained at Camp William Penn, they're starting to come home. But the community members are like, where are men? Where are the ones who helped save this country? And why are they being slighted by not being included in this all white affair? So they create their own celebration in November of 1865 to celebrate the return of Black soldiers through Harrisburg because they took the train to war, they're taking the train home from war. They're coming through Harrisburg and they are being celebrated in a massive parade in which the Black and white community of Harrisburg are celebrating these men. And it happens that USCT Commander Joseph Kiddo, JB Kiddo, is there in Harrisburg. He gives remarks. Simon Cameron gives remarks. And then William Howard Day, who's an abolitionist and someone who's a part of the color convention movement, is the main speaker. But you have Black soldiers returning home to this hero's reception that they did not have in DC. But this is organized specifically by the Black community of Harrisburg, coordinated with the State Equal Rights League across the state of Pennsylvania. And it's a Black affair to celebrate Black returning troops because they felt they were slighted by the Grand Review of Armies that happened in May.
And to those who may not know, what
Mhm.
was the Garnet League and what was
Mhm.
their role in safeguarding Civil War memory?
So one of the things about the Garnet League is they are trying to use what the Civil War was about for them to become full citizens. And Black Pennsylvanians did not have the right to vote because their state constitution in the 1830s removed suffrage altogether for Black men. So the Garnet League is going to fight. We just came from war. Our Black men served. We deserve voting rights. We deserve to be equal citizens. And the Garnet League takes its name from another abolitionist, Henry Highland Garnet. And they're like, we want to be that fierce protector of this history, but in particular, what these men fought for. So they will get the rights that were denied because of the sacrifice of these men, but also for women have a role in this, and the women who are helping to organize the November events. It's a space for men and women to say, this is what the war is about. We demand our rights. And we are going to honor our soldiers and veterans in our midst. So every event, they're celebrating those veterans and then articulating that sacrifice for why they deserve the right to vote. And they will continue that on. And the Garnet League will continue on as an organization that will help mobilize Black men to vote along this memory. But they'll have lectures and other things to make sure that memory of the Civil War persisted and that their rights that they feel that they earned because of the war will be also that political arm that they will go to Harrisburg and the country and say, we deserve this because we saved this country.
And one of the things that I
Mhm.
found most powerful about the book
Mhm.
is that, yes, it's about the Civil War and memory and historical preservation, but it
Mhm.
also talks about how that has a cascading effect to today.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so you talk a little bit about a
Mhm.
2010 reenactment of the USCT parade.
Mhm.
So how did
Mhm.
that reenactment kind of enshrine the legacy of those 1865 organizers?
One of the things that it says is that these communities never forgot. Even the May Slight, the November event, they kept on remembering and honoring. So having it in 2010, where it was a predominantly Black remembrance, that was involved the whole state. And so new audiences and new generations of Americans, white and Black, learned about what this event happened in November. But one of the most powerful things were the Black reenactors that are in this parade. They take on a persona of a known person who actually participated. So sometimes they are the actual descendants of that original soldier. Other times they are reenactors who did their research to say, I am walking in the place of such and such because they served here. And having that experience of the parade and reenactment question and answers by the community, but also a cemetery cleanup in which the grave sites of these men and their descendant communities were there. So one of the things about this particular event was you heard from the living, not just from the dead, and those who had direct ties to the men who walked in that parade were able to talk about their ancestors in real ways and bring out the material. And so this is where we see families who are the caretakers who are with pride showing this to a wider audience. And the Black Harrisburg community and the state are listening. And I think that's the one thing that's different. In November 1865, Harrisburg was, the white Harrisburg in particular, the racial language, I can't describe, where the N word is frequent
Yeah.
and was very hostile, now are celebrated and praised as this is a part of the totality of the Civil War experience in which white and Black is no longer separate, but together. And I think that's one of the beautiful things about the 2010 reenactment because it came full circle. How do you go from the porch to this wider community, and what happens when these fuller stories are put together in such a public way?
How did rural Black Pennsylvania men like Joseph Winters contribute to a politicized Civil War memory?
One of the things that they did was voting. The 15th Amendment is when Black men in Pennsylvania get the right to vote. And this is the Garnet League has been trying, they've been trying, and they're seeing people in Virginia getting the right to vote because the Reconstruction Acts. They're like, well, we were freeborn. What about us? So one of the things that they do is once Black men get the right to vote in the 15th Amendment, the first thing that they do is have a grand ratification parade. And they are parading, we are men who are franchised and we're going to shape the world by voting. And so the first presidential election that they get to actually vote in is also the first gubernatorial election too. It's 1872. They organize into Grant and Wilson clubs. And they are the colored Grant and Wilson clubs because segregation is still a thing. And they use the war and the memory of Gettysburg, but the memory of who they're going to support. And they're going to support the Republican Party because they do not like the Democrats, who they see as the enemies and the ones who are trying to take their rights away. And they're going to say, as men, we're going to vote for our communities and we're going to vote for the ones who will guarantee and enshrine our understanding of the Civil War, including the right to vote in the 15th Amendment, is going to be there. And so Winters writes campaign songs because we forget about how people campaign. They sang songs. So these songs are not just spirituals, but campaign songs around presidential candidates, including Rutherford B. Hayes, James J. Garfield. And they're singing the same songs at all these meetings. And it's a way too for a community that's not really literate, but to remember the Civil War and to remember the sounds of war and the people who they feel are the heroes of the war by voting for them.
Yeah.
And voting for them in mass. And that's why I think about the everyday practical uses of memory. It's not just that annual parade, it's even voting season, which starts in September. They had to really start campaigning. And these men are shaping politics by claiming that they are now newborn franchise men because of what the Civil War did. And that lived experience, this is how they put in practical terms and not the symbolic terms what the war meant.
And talking about another kind of entity, what was the Grand Army of the Republic and how did they influence Civil War memory?
Yes, the Grand Army of the Republic is a veteran organization that unites those who served in the Federal Army and also the Navy, because we do have some people in the Navy who are in there as well. One of the things I like about the GAR is they gave us holidays like Memorial Day. And so that is another holiday on the calendar, which Black people will honor and use. But one of the things about the GAR, they embrace a color blindness. So they're not putting colored next to people's names, even though there will be white and Black separate units, but they come together at events. They call each other comrades and comrades in arms. And in what you see, that comradeship on the local level versus the national really much changes. But it's one way for veteran needs to be cared for. And that communities, whereas the church, the Masons, the Oddfellows are also there, that Black men are using. The GAR is actually caring for the needs of veterans and the special needs that they had for them and their families, including pensions and care work in hospitals. They're doing that work. And for that, the GAR, by introducing comradeship and the color blindness, also to leadership opportunities for veterans that are not always there tied to the church or education, but also holidays and other support networks is so important for keeping the Civil War memory alive. Because for every soldier and veteran, they're in every parade. And at death, they're honored at death, and there's a space for their children to continue on that work. So the spirit of GAR still persists because of that.
And you spend particular attention to kind of elevating the work of Black women and
Mhm.
to how they kind of preserved the Civil
Yeah.
War memory. So, how were Black women involved and how critical were their efforts?
And I will say this, without women, white or black, just white or black, there's no Civil War memory today.
Yeah. Yeah.
Black women in particular are really, they are the mothers of communities, but also aren't. So they are the biological, but also the communal ones. They are the teachers in the regular K through 12 schools, but also Sunday schools. And also they will make sure children show up to everything. They will also preserve everything. They are also the ones who will keep every single obituary, who will show up and have their own communal archives and share that to the second, third, and fourth generation. So they're really thinking about future. And all women, including United Daughters of the Confederacy women, are doing the same thing. But Black women use their role as activism and racial uplift. So a lot of their work is not in traditional organizations. They're in what we think about the club women's movement, the Black history movement, but more importantly, their churches and their schools. And it's their familial church and educational networks is where they're doing this work. And they're not in formal organizations that we would think of. But Black women are everything. Black women in Harrisburg are the ones who raise the most money for the parade and the first monument that gets put up in Harrisburg. Black women in Northeast North Carolina put up a monument in addition to honor the men of Northeast North Carolina who served by having fundraisers, picnics, and everything else. And they're there at celebrations. But Black women also, too, are teaching the next generation. And they're the ones carrying these stories forward. And one of the things that became very important in my book was connecting who these women were. And oftentimes they are tied directly to a soldier or veteran of that Civil War generation, but others are not. It's something that gets labeled as women's work. And women's work means care work, and care work means you make sure the next generation knows this information. So even if they're not tied, there's an ethics about Black women's activism and organization that brings that work in conjunction with Civil War memory. It's just one aspect of what they do amongst everything else. And Black women in particular, like Edna Napper and others, are doing this behind the scenes work while writing themselves out of the narrative
Yeah.
because they're promoting other communal we rather than the me and the men and the children. And they're sacrificing all the time without acknowledging what they're doing. So this is where it gets tricky, how to find those women at times and not knowing where they are, but they show up at everything.
Yeah. Well, I think your book at least partially
Mhm.
corrects some of
Mhm.
their trying to write
Mhm.
themselves out and
Yeah.
hide behind the scenes.
Mhm.
And so many who study the Civil War have likely heard about the lost cause myth, but you spend some time talking about the one cause.
Mhm.
So what was that and how did Black veterans support it?
This is where I am so grateful for the work of Barb Gannon and how she looks at African American veterans, largely in the GAR, who are doing this work of remembrance. And the one cause, which is really fascinating for me, and it's a concept, and I could see it on the ground, even though they don't use that language, they served in the federal armies and committed to victory. And that's what they remember. Like, we are the cause that won. We won, and we won rights as part of this. And so one of the things that happens is this is it's a part of the GAR work in many ways
Mhm.
and what they will do, but parades. They will be at every parade. Those communities I write about in South Central Pennsylvania and Maryland, they will be at Antietam every single commemoration and as part of the parade, but also on the battlefield when they're honoring and doing those commemorations. They go to Gettysburg all the time as well. But they create this leisure network among trains. And this is one of the things that I really was fascinated. Like they will rent out entire trains for families to go on excursions to visit one another. So they're going throughout the state of Pennsylvania, south to Baltimore and DC, just to make sure they have something to do and they can cement those bonds, those intergenerational bonds, and to show that no, we won. We have new rights. We have the right to travel. We have the right to leisure. We have the right to politics because we were on the side that won. And the one cause is where you can see also that slight rejection of the lost cause. We're like, you're the losers, you're the victors. And we're going to keep on doing this in our ways that make sense. And by embracing the one cause as well, they set up a model for future veterans in the community, especially in the Spanish American War, the Mexican Cessation Border War, World War One. That's how those veterans learn what to do. We're going to embrace the cause of the side that won, and we're going to have these traditions of what we should do. And it's a leadership model for leisure and social practices, but also politics as well. And how do you, as a veteran, embrace this for the family and care? And so the one cause is something I think we need to bring more of. And if you haven't read Barb Gannon's book, please do. And you'll understand why that's one of the bookends I use for this idea of Black Civil War memory. And then the emancipationists on the other end, David Blight, and how everything else fits in between. But that one cause, that one thing, they're like, we are on the side that won. Yeah. And we're going to honor that and remember that.
And can you speak on the debate over the National Emancipation Day and why the choice of January 1st was perhaps a missed opportunity?
Yeah, so one of the things about this debate, which is occurring at a time where African Americans are trying to figure out their calendar. So African Americans celebrate multiple emancipation dates. And so January 1st being one, but then we have like 4 or 5 other ones in the year. So this is in this movement, do we have one single day that connects all of us? And to celebrate that day, in addition to the smaller ones, but this one gets all the national attention. And the challenge is January 1st centers on Lincoln. And the communities, in particular, Richmond wants April 3rd. Because they're like, if we're going to talk about the end of the Civil War, we're going to have to talk about Virginia and Richmond, and what happens there. And others are putting out dates like the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation in September, because for them that unified more people. And it also showed that there was multiple days and they could not agree. And in the end, they're like, well, January 1st has to be the date then. But what that means is January 1st it becomes this missed opportunity because those other dates fall off, except for those who promote their individual Emancipation Day. So April 3rd is still a day that is celebrated in Richmond. The Washington, D.C. Emancipation Day is still celebrated, but other communities don't celebrate that. Instead, they celebrate January 1st and with watch night ceremony on December 31st. And then that's it. So the history of these other emancipation days have fallen off. And it also has led to questions about Juneteenth as well. Is this the national day? But for some of the communities that I study, especially in Pennsylvania, they never had Juneteenth because that is a Texas day for them. And even as older adults, when it comes around the 70s and 80s, that was never part of their tradition, like January 1st was, July 4th was, and others. So we still have this debate on there's multiple days, which one is the date? So one of the things that I know now with this missed opportunity is I celebrate them all now. I'm just like, let's go back to the calendar, because trying to fix that date is going to be so difficult unless you center it on the 1st of January and center it on Lincoln without talking about who did the liberating and those African American communities that had fought for these other days to be there. So instead of just embracing one, let's embrace them all.
Well, and the variety of experiences of the different communities is a perfect segue to my next question, which is how did the experiences of Black Pennsylvanians differ from those in Richmond when it came to the work in preserving Civil War memory?
Yeah, this is where Richmond is trying to do a lot. And I think it's because it was the capital of the Confederacy. So they have all eyes on them, but also a point of pride and a desire to lead because of where they were in during the war. And so for them, and they also have more money. It's a much more highly mobile, educated black middle class there. Maggie Lena Walker is there, John Marshall Jr. So people who go through Richmond Color normal and highly and college degrees and then come back and make money. So we have a solid black middle class there. And they feel like we deserve to be the leaders. We deserve to set the tone for what's there. And they have the money and the political capital to do so because they are in Richmond. They can pull on that national symbolism in ways. So Richmond will do things because of where they are and their historic ties to the Civil War. Black Pennsylvanians, especially rural Black Pennsylvanians, when we talk about Pennsylvania, we talk about Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Harrisburg. Well, if you're not from those communities and you're in the middle parts of rural poverty and community life, one of the things that you have, people don't come to you, you go to other places. So for them, Richmond, everyone came to Richmond. They had the money, the wills, and everything else to have the big events because they were Richmond. Pennsylvania, they used the train. They will use the railroad networks of Pennsylvania and that part, and also into Maryland and DC to form communities. So they have to travel. And therefore, it'll be traveling, food related, smaller events for fundraising that involves the entire community rather than 4 or 5 people who are mobilizing the event. So it takes a lot more to get an event to go on. And so a lot of their work tends to be behind the scenes, hyper local, in their church cemeteries, in their churches, in their school rooms, whereas Richmond has the newspapers that can advertise everything. They could tell what, and we can trace out better what they did.
Yeah.
And they also took photographs, so we could also trace material culture and photography in what they did. Pennsylvania, we don't have that unless you're in Pittsburgh, unless you're in Harrisburg, unless you're in Philadelphia. And for a family, one of the things about the book you'll see is I organized by my family.
Mhm.
My relatives said, "Yeah, we're not from Philly. And we are the, we are South Central Pennsylvania. Like we are very clear where we are." And by just studying Philly and Harrisburg and Pittsburgh, you miss those stories too. So they're very sensitive about being ignored even
Yeah.
within the state, but the attention's not there on them because they were on the Pennsylvania and northern sides as if the Civil War did not affect them, but it
Mm.
did.
Yeah.
Richmond has all the gaze and the eyes and the historical back end that their cause is more justified and people see and understand why.
Yeah.
And so it's so different, but in some ways it's saying the same. Every event is in a church. They have parades. They will fight to be heard and to also train the next generations about what the war meant and what are the symbolisms and what were the sacrifices that are there too. It's just how they do it, the money behind it, and the publicity is what the biggest difference is.
And I think for me, one of the standout parts of this book is your focus on memory and
Mhm.
preserving memory. It just feels so important right now and poignant. So, how does understanding the work of preserving Civil War memory help us understand our present moment?
One of the things I will say, this book is incredibly timely, but not because I wanted it to be timely. Uh, these individuals did not need someone to tell them to remember the Civil War.
Yeah.
They, but one of the things that they clearly rejected was the people telling them they should forget. They
Yeah.
should forget that Black people participated in the war. They should forget what that Civil War generation sacrifices were. And they should only rely on one narrative that was a top down narrative. And that's not how these communities remembered. They remembered people, they remembered families, and they created their own means without being told to do so. And not anyone to validate, because all the validation they needed was from their community. They were willing to ignore people to tell them to accept lies and myths. They're like, that's not our truth. That's not what we're going to preserve. We're going to preserve what is our truth, our knowledge, and we have it here.
Yeah.
because it's our local communities that need this more. And the national can catch up. The historians, we can ignore them because we don't need them to tell us what our truth is. And I think that way is they did this with the least of things, but their methods were some of the ways I think is so poignant for today.
Yeah.
They wrote stuff down.
Yep.
They went to the cemeteries, they did that care work and cleaning up, and they told the stories from even the spaces that they could protect. They didn't have access to archives, they created their own archives. They didn't have access to elite institutions and scholars that would write their history. They wrote their own community histories. They preserved their own materials and then donated them. And they sustained the oral tradition that persisted throughout the generations over and over in very ways. I think about Caritha Mitchell's book about homemade citizenship.
Mm.
This is homemade citizenship
Yeah.
and Civil War memory and the memory of the communities at this time over time is what they preserved. And I think in today is we don't need someone to say what to remember,
Yep.
how to remember it, but what we can do is document.
Yeah.
We can document our current moment. We can also push back when possible in those conversations against the lies that still persist of the Civil War. In particular, African Americans didn't participate or it was only on the battlefield. They're like, no, it wasn't.
Yeah.
What about these communities? And we have more work to do.
Yeah.
And I think the other thing in this present moment is hopefully where it really is in question what this memory was. Talk to people. I think this is where we can actually have those human connections and listening and go into communities and asking, what was the Civil War like? Do you have what materials do you have? And also too to get written down and honor new traditions. If you have a local Emancipation Day, what's your plan for that? And for me, like even Juneteenth, what's your Juneteenth regime? If this is one Emancipation Day, what's your reading list going to be? Are you going to do community activism? Are you going to that cemetery, honoring those traditions and doing those things that were there before? And I think in the end, in this moment, we are not helpless because the people of the past weren't either, and they had the least of things, but they understood the stakes of what it does it mean to not tell this history and to let it die out
Yeah.
and to let these memories die out. They understood that as something that they could not afford to have. And I think in this day is to remember our truths, remember the communities that you're in collaboration with. Ignore the noise, because the noise will always be there. But if you need examples, read my book because I give you plenty of examples of communities who continue to preserve, even though they were told to absolutely accept lies and myths and to forget their past.
Yeah. And I think this book has so many lessons, so many things that you can learn in those pages. But I'm curious for you, what do you want readers to take away from your book?
Oh man. So I will say I have two sets of readers for a reason is this is a love letter for the communities who shared their histories with me. They allowed me to be a steward of the past and their collective past and memories. And I want them to know I listened. I heard and I helped to clarify what some of the things that weren't documented in there. And so for me, for those communities who are doing that in there that I did not write about, because I wrote about the communities I knew,
Yeah.
because I wanted to make sure I could get that down. We need more community histories. So I hope for those communities who are still in the struggle, who are still doing this work, to write down your stories, to get in contact with your local colleges and universities and get your community history there and have the framework to see like we were right. So that's my first hope for those readers. For academic scholars and those who are becoming in graduate school and undergrads, we have so much work to be done on Civil War memory and Black Civil War memory in particular. This should not be one of the first books to do this,
Mhm.
but it is. And so for me, I hope that we do more and to research more communities and add more precision. And I hope I gave a framework for how to do this,
Mhm.
what books to read, how to engage with both the porch archives and your traditional archives, how to listen and try to find people who weren't really documented well in the physical record, but to also ask the question, where are Black people in our narratives? Are they victims? These aren't victims. These are people who are institutional builders of preserving memories, and they're preservers of memory. So how do we talk about them beyond just a victimization? And also, don't think about this counter memory, because for a lot of these communities, they're not thinking about centering white people in their narrative. They're talking about their children and communities. And so they're centering Blackness, Black knowledge, and Black epistemology. And so when we talk about even how they are remembered in comparison to other communities, we have to give them more agency than what we do and present them in their fullness and not flatten out their stories. So for me, the hope is that we will have more histories, more books, and that we can tell this more fleshed out, that we can really have Black Civil War memory as on par with all the other traditional Civil War memories, even if that means we have to have our own subfield of Black Civil War memory studies to get this done, because it's going to take at least another 20, 30 years to get this done. It's not impossible.
Yeah, and your book, I think, is not only a fascinating history, but it's also a guidebook. You outline exactly how future researchers and historians and academics can kind of replicate your work. So, yet another reason to pick up this fantastic book. And is there anything we haven't discussed yet that you want future readers to know?
One of the things I will say is you'll learn more about my Civil War ancestor. I have several, but I wrote about a particular one. And one of the things about doing that story is my Pennsylvania family members are asking more questions now because of what I wrote. So my work, even though it is published, doesn't mean it hasn't ended, because I am now seen as one of the family kin keepers on both sides of my family, which was a role I never wanted, but it's the role I have. But one of the things I will say is my work in doing these stories is not stopping. It's just that we have so much more to learn, including on the communities I wrote about.
Yeah. Well, to the listeners out there, please be sure to pick up a copy of Unforgettable Sacrifice. It is a beautifully written, well-argued analysis of historical memory that not only offers a fresh perspective on the Civil War, but gives us a better understanding of our current moment and how we can do better in the future. Dr. Green, thank you so much for taking your time today. I have so appreciated this conversation.
Thank you for having me. This was so much fun.
Again, my sincerest thanks to Dr. Green for sharing her scholarship with me. If you have any interest in historical memory or how we choose to remember and document past experiences, or any passing interest in Civil War history, this is definitely the book for you. Thanks, peeps. I'll see you next week. Thanks for tuning in, and I hope you enjoyed this episode of Civics and Coffee. If you want to hear more small snippets from American history, be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for joining me, and I look forward to our next cup of coffee together.